Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Christine Lee. I'm a professor in anthropology at California State University, and today I'm doing a lecture on women warriors and where are the women warriors and evidence of gender equality on the Mongolian steppes. So first of all, I want to introduce you guys to what I do. So I'm a bioarchaeologist. Bioarchaeology is the study of human skeletal remains excavated from archaeological sites. I work mainly on skeletal collections in China and Mongolia, and I specialize in dental anthropology, paleopathology, which is the study of ancient diseases, and also biological variation. So I'm mainly interested in questions about individual and populational identity. So I've looked at the formation of ethnic identity, cultural body modification, and gender roles in nomadic societies. So recent research projects have included looking at patterns of violence along the Silk Road, how disfigurement from leprosy was viewed in Asian society, and this present study on the presence of women warriors in nomadic societies. So while working on other research projects, I noticed that there is a lack of women in the past, especially in East Asia, writing about their own experiences. And even if we have their writings, so actual writings from these women, sometimes even their own names have been lost. So recently, several archaeological projects have focused on women performing what are viewed as traditionally male roles. The most recently highlighted one, especially online, is women participating in big game hunting in ancient America. And other research has identified previously excavated individuals from Viking and Scythian burials as male warriors because they have weapons found in these burials. An actual re-examination of these skeletons has determined that actually some of these are females. So this notion that women could not be warriors or hunters is probably a modern day bias we've put on these past societies. So I wanted to see if information from the women's bodies themselves might actually give a clearer picture on their past gender roles. So first of all, if we're going to look at how East Asia sort of viewed women's roles in the present and in the past, we kind of have to look at history and determine when and where these ideas may have started. Keep in mind that there are many different forms of freedom for women in the past. So we're going to start looking at China. So Wu Zetian is the only empress of China, the only one that's been declared the whole ruler of China. So this Buddhist statue was paid for by her, the entire temple complex. And it's believed this particular Buddha is actually based on her face. So originally, it was believed in China that if there was a female ruler, that was only done if there were no other male family available, and women were considered unfit to rule on their own. And Wu Zetian was declared empress, but after her, women were again prevented from ruling by themselves. By the Song dynasty, which is 960 to 1279, a woman's place was considered inside the household. An ideal woman was expected to be sort of fragile and childish. Girls and women would only be seen by their male relatives, and they were expected to be pious, family-oriented, and obedient. We're going to take a detour. We're going to take a detour to Japan, mainly because during the Heian period, which is a similar time period as many of the medieval things we're going to look at today, women there had a very unique position. Murasakai Shikubu is a woman of the court of the Heian period, and she is believed to have written the first fiction novel called The Tale of Genji. There are many women writers during this period. We do have their actual writings. Again, many of them, we don't have their actual names. We have their titles. But these are not women warriors. These are very different than what we would call a woman warrior. They're very literary, they're very confined, and yet they had a lot of freedom of movement, they also had freedom over their personal lives. And in fact, many of them would have been pretty scandalous, even by today's definition. So I just wanted to mention that there are other forms of freedom and other ways where women have had a lasting impact in society. So now we're going to move into nomadic societies. So Tolui and Sorgatani are Mongolian, and they are from the period of around 1190 to 1252. Tolui was the youngest son of Genghis Khan, so he never actually ruled. What he did inherit was when his father died as the youngest son, he inherited the lands that were traditionally Mongolian and also from his family. He did not inherit the rest of the Mongol Empire at the time, but he did inherit the Mongol homeland. And Sorgatani was Genghis Khan's favorite daughter-in-law. So she maintained her husband's territory after he died early, and she refused to remarry in order to raise her sons. She actually was able to not have to obey the Khan at the time, who wanted her to remarry for political reasons. And in turn, two of her sons became Khan. The most famous one is Kublai Khan, who finally conquered China and started the Yuan dynasty. So this shows that she had enough power to run her own husband's territory, refuse marriage requests from the Khan, and powerful enough to put two of her own sons on the throne. So in this picture, notice she's actually seated next to her husband at the same level. In Chinese depictions, throne rooms only have one chair for the king and not for the queen. The queen is actually seated in a different place. So when it comes to actual Mongolian queens, there were many powerful Mongolian queens. They ran the country while their husbands conquered the rest of the world. Genghis Khan's mother is also credited with helping to create Mongolia itself. So Mongolian women had more freedom and power over their own lives than any of the women from the neighboring countries. So my thinking is that this type of viewpoint, that a woman is very capable on her own, very capable of supporting her family and her country, and also are very kind of able to be martial, must actually go back in time in history. So if we look at the Qidan queens, which are the period before the Mongols, they also have a written history of several very powerful queens. So this is a direct lineage backwards for powerful nomadic women. So at least two queens written in the histories owned military troops or commanded military troops in battle. One queen actually defeated the Chinese in battle. Another queen fought against the Chinese and the Mongols. So this whole idea that Qidan women are expected to be excellent horse riders, and they're also expected to be very brave and courageous. So that is a very dark contrast, or not dark, deep contrast to what would have been expected in the behavior of a Chinese woman at the time. So we have direct historical evidence that this type of brave and courageous woman goes back to Qidan times. So then I wanted to see if there was any other historical record further back from that. So that's where you start seeing evidence of the Ballad of Mulan, so around 400 AD. So this is actually called the period of disunion. It's when the Han Dynasty in China and the Xiongnu Empire in Mongolia had collapsed around the same time, around 220 AD. And so once these two empires shatter, they break up into up to 16 different little statelets. So Mulan actually lived or would have lived in one of these states, and she would have fought against another one of these small states. So Mulan was not Chinese ethnically, but Shenbe, and she did not fight against the Mongols, but probably the Eastern Turks. So the Chinese version of the story is much later than she actually lived, and it shows her sacrificing herself for her father and her family and disguising herself as a man. So these are the qualities the Chinese wanted in a woman when the story was actually written down much later. But remember, she's not Chinese, and the original story instead emphasized her bravery, again, which is a normal expectation of the women of these nomadic empires. So does this sort of brave woman go back further? So the last one that we can see historically written about is Taiyan, or Lady Wenji. She is actually Chinese. So she lived in this period of disunion, and she was kidnapped from her home and sent as a concubine to a high-ranking Shenbe minister. She stayed for 12 years and at least had 2 sons. Then the Chinese ruler at the time and an old friend of her father's ransomed her back into China. So she had to return to China, but without her children, and she was actually forced to marry again. She's famous because she wrote about her experiences during those years, and it's a very famous story to the Chinese, since she is considered an obedient woman who is patriotic and returns to her country. But her story is also very, very popular to the Qidan and the Mongols later. In her, in Lady Wenji, they saw a very brave woman who is able to bridge both cultures and survive. So this is the end of the written historical evidence for women warriors in in Mongolia and northern China. So from the medieval period, we have these written records all the way back until sort of the beginning of the period of disunion. So, and of course, the period of disunion records are kind of more iffy. So archaeologists have excavated tombs with women buried with weapons in this region, and then concluded that these women were warriors. However, I wanted to see if you could physically see evidence of this type of behavior on the actual bodies of the women themselves. So I analyzed 29 individuals, all from elite burials. So there were 16 males, 10 females, and 3 adolescents. So this is a picture of Arajin Gosgor, which is the excavation we have in Mongolia right now. So several of the individuals are from these elite burials. These are Shenbe, and you can see how deep the entrance shaft is, and at the very end you can see the light that is the entrance to the burial chamber, and the wooden horse on the left and the pottery you see behind were actually in that chamber. So I covered 3 time periods, so I'm going to briefly tell you about them so that you have an idea of what they would have been like. So the Shogun Period was the first nomadic empire in Mongolia. So they are the original people the Great Wall was built to keep out. Of course, once the Great Wall was built, they just went through the wall and had many wars with the Chinese and extracted tribute from the Chinese in the form of silk, cloth, bronze mirrors, and imperial brides, among many other things. While the ruling party of the Xiongnu is ethnically Xiongnu, they had many different ethnicities within their empire, including the later period Shenbe and Turks. So they all lived within the empire, although the ruling elite were Xiongnu. So the Xiongnu built monumental tombs all over Mongolia. And on the right, you see one of the monumental actual queen's tombs in Mongolia. So again, they would have had a earthen mound on top of this with possibly a memorial center on top. And then within this earthen mound, there are all these stones. And underneath all these stones is an actual wooden burial chamber. On the left is an actual rug that has been preserved from one of the tombs depicting mythical creatures fighting. And so the interesting thing is the fact that some of the tombs, especially up farther north towards Siberia, have actually preserved cloth and wooden objects. So the next period is the Shenbe period. So the Shenbe actually conquered the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were kind of disintegrating anyway, but they conquered the entire area of Mongolia. But there are lot of political fragmentation. So in northern China, that whole area, sort of between a buffer of Mongolia and China, splits into multiple statelets. So there's mass warfare. None of these states last for very long. As soon as their rulers die, maybe 2 or 3 generations, the entire country collapses and a different state forms. So there's mass movements of people, whether from the warfare, whether it's from the disruption of trade and economy and famine. So you see mass movements of people. So it's probably the first time many different people of different ethnicities, languages, cultures, and religions moved freely through this zone. Because you're having all these states rise and collapse fairly quickly historically, these borders seem pretty porous. And so people are moving through these areas fairly freely. So when you look at migration into this area before the Shenbe period, so the Shogun period and earlier, you see mainly young men showing up that are not local. But once you have the Shenbe period, what's interesting is it looks like entire families are moving around, and some of them may be moving very long distances. So again, remember Mulan, that whole story is from this time period. And the Shenbe are not from originally this portion of Mongolia. They're originally from Eastern Mongolia and Manchuria, where there is forests and rivers, and they are nomadic, but they're also semi-agricultural. So they take over this entire portion of Mongolia. So on the left, you see, again, our excavation at Archery. There are about 100 tombs. They are Shenbe period. And then on the right, you see some of the things that would have been tomb offerings for the dead. So on the right, you see military warriors on horseback. Shenbe have a very distinctive headgear with a little top knot on top. And so that's what you're seeing right here. So the last period is the Turkic period. So they originate actually from southern Siberia, and they conquer this area after the Xianbei and Rouran. So they are a new dynasty, another foreign dynasty in Mongolia. So they are probably the people Mulan is depicted fighting in her story. They're interesting in that they built the first urban areas in Mongolia. So you start to see multi-story buildings. You start to see wall fortifications and these brick buildings. You also see, like on the right, these wall markers. They just go for quite a long time. No one's quite sure what they're marking, but they're there. They also is the first time you're going to see human-shaped statues show up also at this time, and also the beginnings of some types of writing. So I looked for evidence that women were doing the same things as men. If men were training for warfare or defending their homes, then maybe some women would be trained too. I looked for evidence of warfare trauma, arthritis, and musculoskeletal markers associated with horseback riding and musculoskeletal markers associated with archery. While there are some spectacular pictures I'm showing you of warfare trauma, there is actually no warfare trauma from the sites that I looked at. That doesn't mean that no one from these sites participated in warfare. It just means no one from these sites had trauma on them that is probably caused from warfare. One of the reasons is because probably they are elite burials. So the elite normally would not be fighting hand-to-hand combat or in close combat. So it may be that they were officers, or it is possible they were just not involved in warfare. I did want to show one slide of what warfare would look like, just to give you guys an idea. This is from my other study along the Silk Road. As you can see, it's actually 3 views of the same individual. So he definitely has a lot of holes in his head. These holes are not accidental. These are high velocity, at least arrow points, or maybe something more like bigger than that that have been hurled at this individual. You can also see on the right-hand photograph, there is a sword blow to the top of his head that is actually healed. So this person's job may have been to defend or protect something along the Silk Road, and therefore he was put in these dangerous situations more than once in his life, obviously. You can see in the middle photograph, the lines going across his head, and where the lines are going on the left side, those are called radiating fractures. That is when someone has a blow to the head where the force is so great, it actually shatters the bone to sort of dissipate the force. So again, this is from a different study, but just to show you what that type of trauma would look like. It's very dramatic, it's very obvious. And none of the individuals from this site have that, or this study. What we do have is there are a lot of arthritis and musculoskeletal markers that are indicative of horse riding. That's expected, but it's also nice to see. So there are bone markers along the spine, in the pelvis, in the legs and arms that will occur because that is how you have to hold yourself in the seat, and also the specific way they would have been riding horses at that time. So in all of the males, 80 to 100% of them were riding horses for very long periods and very often. In females, 33 to 100% of them were riding horses. So among the women, there is some variability who's riding horses and who's not. And in the adolescents, all of them have evidence of horseback riding. This means that horseback riding started sometime in childhood. If all the adolescents already show the markers for horseback riding, it must mean they learned how to ride horses at a period earlier than that. That's probably normal. In modern Mongolia, children also still learn to ride horses fairly young. All of the traumas found at these sites are probably from horseback riding. They all look like they were caused probably from either falling off a horse or being on a horse and hitting something as the horse is riding through. It does mean that there is more trauma in men than in women from these falls or running into things. The reason why there's more trauma among the men is probably because men are actually spending more time on horseback than the women. There is also an increase in the amount of horseback riding trauma from the Xiongnu into the Shenbe period. So what that's telling me is that something in the pattern of horseback riding changed in the Shenbe period. The easiest assumption is that they're just on horseback a lot longer, and therefore there's more there are more chances for them to have an accident. So on the left, you see two thoracic vertebrae in your spine. So they're in the middle portion of your spine. And you can see there are two grooves on each of those vertebrae. Those grooves are caused when the disc in between your vertebra sort of rupture. And that rupture is caused when there is sort of up and down movement compressing on your spine. That is a very common thing that happens in athletic sports. It's also very common in horseback riding. So many horseback riders, especially riders who do it for extended periods every day, all day, will have this type of sort of minor injury. So when we look at the time periods, in the Xiongnu period, half of the women rode horses for long periods of time. Half of them didn't. But when you get to the Shenbe period, all of the women in the Shenbe period rode horses all of the time. And when then you get to the last period, the Turkic period, this again shows women not riding horseback very often at all. They have the lowest proportion of women, less than 30% who are riding horses. So you have half of the women riding horses a lot of the time in Xiongnu, all of the women riding horses a lot in the Shenbe, and then a very huge drop off in the Turkic period. So next, we look at archery. So in all of the time periods, 80% to 100% of the men had musculoskeletal markers for archery. So when you look at these musculoskeletal markers, every time you move your body, especially if you overextend your muscles, especially, for instance, if you're working out and you get sore and then you have to rest your muscles and you have to work out a different part of your body, that's to let the muscles that have been ripped repair themselves. But on the body, if you do this over and over, we can actually see those markers. So those are the musculoskeletal markers. So for archery, I'm looking at musculoskeletal markers in the chest, shoulder, elbow, and fingers. So 50 to 100% of women participated in archery. So while some Xiongnu women and some Shenbe women definitely participated in archery based on the muscle markers, Turkic women definitely did not. For whatever reason, not only are Turkic women not riding on horses very often, they are not participating in archery. If it's assumed that archery is mainly trained for most of the men and some of the women for hunting, then again, Xiongnu women, some of them, Shenbe women, most of them, and then Turkic women, none of them are participating in hunting. So this picture shows in the middle the different types of arrows that have been excavated from Xiongnu burials. So you can see there's a wide range of arrows. Most of these are probably for hunting, not for actually warfare, although they are famous for making arrows in warfare that actually scream or whistle when they're in the air to scare the enemy. The top portion, all of the bone you see there, are actually the ends of a bow. So on the right, you see a Mongolian woman demonstrating for me how to fire an arrow. She's actually quite good. And on the left, you see two clavicles, and you can tell there's divots in those clavicles. Those are caused by, again, the muscles in the chest moving as they are pulling back the bow over and over again. So, were there any women from these time periods that sort of exhibited warrior activity? So while the women in the Xiongnu period have evidence of riding horses quite often and doing archery, there is a difference in the amount of horseback riding and archery between the men and women. So while they do, some of them are participating in these activities, it's a lot less than the men. And then in the final period, the Turkic period men again are riding horses and practicing archery, but not as often as, or not as much as the two other periods. So even the men are not riding horses or practicing archery as much. And the Turkic women show the least evidence of horseback riding or archery at all. So it's this middle period where the Shenbe men show a lot of horseback riding and a lot of archery. And then the women are also participating in a lot of horseback riding and archery. So the women are participating in these two activities almost at the same rate as the men. And it's from the Shenbe period that I found two women who exactly were horseback riding a lot and also practicing archery. So they are the two most likely women who would have participated in any overtly warrior-like actions. So my interpretation of this is if the women are being allowed to do exactly what men are allowed, they have the freedom to go riding anywhere, they have the freedom to go hunting, I think it shows a high level of gender equality for that place and that time. Again, this is probably a product of their time, which is the period of disunion. It's filled with political unrest. It is the period of Mulan. And maybe they required that the women help defend their homes with the men. So again, this goes along with the preliminary research that shows migration into Mongolia in the earlier periods, Xiongnu and earlier, was predominantly young men. But during this period of disunion, whole families are moving great distances. So if you think of the fact that an entire family must be moving into different statelets over their lives for safety and also to escape unrest, it would make sense that the women would have to be able to defend their family and maybe even their homes and their country as well as the men. So how does this actually fit into a larger picture of East Asia? This period of disunion has largely been ignored by archaeologists. This is a period of great fragmentation. It's not a glorious empire. So my thinking is maybe this thought process is not right. Maybe not exactly wrong, but not exactly right. Because maybe this really is the time and place that exciting things are starting, and whole new concepts of identity and society are being formed. So artwork from this time period starts to portray more women more often than in the past. In the past, children sort of belong to the man's family, and the man's family raises these children. So in public places, men are often depicted with their children as their descendants and their responsibility. But in this time period, you start seeing women in public areas, in paintings and in artwork and in stele and in monuments, being portrayed actively raising their children with their husbands' families. They also show women participating in commerce, in hunting, and in sports alongside men. And finally, this is also the time period that Buddhism is introduced into East Asia. So women are also shown as donors in public memorials associated with Buddhism. So the fact that they have the monetary means and the freedom to donate in their own names also shows that this time period exhibits more freedom for women than is previously thought. So larger numbers of women during this period also have access to education, and they are also literate. So you start to see women's writings. There were women who wrote before, but a wider variety of social economic women who are able to now read and write. So through all of these actions, women during the period of disunion appear to be taking an active part in the formation of new types of social identity. Thank you very much.